Hi everyone, I'm Ethan, and this is my presentation on System Center Configuration Manager, or otherwise known as SCCM, for my final CS338 project. So SCCM, otherwise known as Configuration Manager, is what most people call it, allows sysadmins to deploy applications, software updates, and operating systems to devices in their organization. It's also a way for admins to make sure devices are compliant with their policy, and it allows the management of servers, desktops, and also laptops. So there's several other capabilities, and these include analytics, cloud attached management, so this integrates a lot with Azure, endpoint protection, and mobile device management. SCCM also integrates with a lot of technologies that we've already learned, these being Azure to host its cloud services, WSUS or Windows Server Update Services to manage software updates and deploy these to PCs. It uses group policy and DNS, and it also uses Active Directory primarily for asset discovery. So SCCM has undergone some recent changes. It's now a part of Endpoint Configuration Manager, which is a larger piece of software from Microsoft, and it includes, with SCCM, Intune, which is the mobile device management solution, Desktop Analytics, and Windows Autopilot, which is a newer technology that's used for OS deployment. So SCCM is not a small application by any means. It actually requires quite a bit of hardware for it to fully function. And if you are doing this in a lab environment, which is what I'm doing, if you have the site and the database server installed on the same machine, which a site is where clients receive policy from, you can also have multiple child sites in a SCCM deployment. So let's say you have an office in Seattle. You can also have another site in, let's say, Chicago, and these can sync up with each other and receive policy from each other to fully function. But you also will need a SQL database server for SCCM, and usually this will require 2 to 4 CPU cores and 8 to 12 gigs of RAM. I'll be hosting this on a virtual machine, so this isn't really a problem for me. So if you have a site and database server installed on the same machine in production, this goes up quite a bit to 16 CPU cores and 96 gigabytes of RAM, which 80% of it is allocated to SQL Server. So SCCM is, like I said, a pretty big piece of software, and it's used to manage a lot of Windows devices in an organization, which the max is 150,000. So yeah, it can manage quite a bit. And this is what is recommended by Microsoft, so it's theoretical, and it usually doesn't require this amount. I know we have SCCM at Kelvin here. I work in CIT, not specifically with SCCM, but we do not use nearly this much amount of compute power. So on to the software requirements for SCCM. Normally it's deployed on Windows Server. In this case, I'll be using Server 2019, but it also works on 2016 and 2012 R2. There's a couple server roles you'll have to install to make it work. One is the .NET framework. Another is WSUS for software updates, and IIS. This is used to check certificates if you're setting it up with HTTPS and PKI. There's also some other things that IIS is used for in SCCM that I don't fully know, but it is used with Config Manager. It also uses something called Windows Deployment Services, or WDS. This is allowed for PXE booting, what most people call it. This is to deploy an operating system over a network. So if you're deploying an OS and rather than using something like a USB to boot to Windows, it will grab a IP from a DHCP server, and it will grab the contents of a special file called a WIM file, and this is what's used to load Windows and install it over a network. You also need the Windows ADK. This is a tool that lets you customize Windows images. It includes a couple things, something called the DISM, the pre-installation environment. So this is what's used when you're PXE booting over the network. This is what's used to deploy an OS. User state migration tool. This is used if you want to migrate users' data from one computer to another. Let's say you're doing like an in-place upgrade from like Windows 7 to Windows 10. You can use this to migrate their data. Volume activation management and Windows Performance Toolkit. So this is what's included in the ADK. You also need a database server. So SCCM uses Microsoft SQL Server, and this can be installed on the same server as SCCM or on a remote server. In this case, I'll be running it on the same server. So there's a couple of user interfaces with Config Manager. One of those being the console. You'll see this more when I do a demo. This is what's used after you install Configuration Manager on your server. It's used to configure sites and clients, and it's the main part of administration for SCCM. And then there's Software Center. This is an app that's installed when you install the Config Manager client on a Windows desktop. And this is what allows users to request and install software that you manage and deploy. So you control which software users can install on a computer. And it allows users to view device compliance against your policies. And it allows a couple other things like remote administration tools and a couple other things for software updates. So here we are in my SCCM server. There's a couple things I wanted to point out here. Usually when you do an install like this, at least from what I followed, you're going to want multiple drives for depending on what you're using them for. So you're going to want to drive primarily for the Config Manager install, and then a couple other drives for its content library and the SQL database files. This is just best practice. You usually don't want everything on your local or your OS disk. But let's take a look at the Config Manager console. So there is way too much for me to cover in this video. So I'm going to be highlighting something you can do with Config Manager, which is deploy an operating system over the network. So if I come into here's software library, under operating systems, this is where you manage your operating system images, your boot images, which is what's used in the Windows PE. And I've already imported a evaluation edition of Windows 10 20H2. This is the enterprise version. So there's a couple things I had to do to get this working. I won't go into details just because it does take a little bit of time. But in order to deploy Windows 10 over the network, you use something what's called a task sequence. And this basically goes through a series of tasks in order. You can see here there's it restarts into the Windows pre-installation environment. It partitions the disk either with BIOS or UEFI if it's a newer system. It applies the operating system, in this case Windows 10 Enterprise Evaluation, and then it applies Windows settings So I've done a couple things here. I've just enabled the local administrator password just in case something fails if it doesn't join my domain, which I've already set it up to automatically do once it gets deployed. I'm able to do this using an account, a special service account with some special permissions in my domain. And then also we'll apply device drivers if it's a physical machine. And then it will install the config manager client package. So this is that software center that I was talking about earlier. So let's go back to my virtual machine and see how this is done. So I've created a test virtual machine in ESXi, and this is what's going to be used to deploy Windows 10 over the network from SCCM. So one thing to note here is that it has to be on the same network as your config manager server. In this case it is for me. I have a special VLAN for this, and your DVD drive is just going to be your host device. You won't want to load an ISO file or anything like that. This is because we're doing it over the network. So let's go ahead and power this on, and it will attempt to boot into the EFI network. And you can see the WDS boot manager here, and I'm just going to hit enter, and that's the IP of my SCCM server, and it's grabbing the WIM file for Windows 10. And after this gets done loading, it should start deploying. And I will pause the video here and come back when it's done. So a quick note here, this is what it looks like as config manager is deploying the OS. You can fully automate this. In this case, there's a couple things I'll have to click next on. I have to pick the task sequence that I created earlier to deploy Windows 10, and it's grabbing that task sequence, and as you can see, we are starting to partition the disk and follow those steps that were specified in the task sequence. Alright, here we are in our test virtual machine that we just deployed Windows on, and as you can see, we have a valid license of Windows 10 Enterprise, valid for 90 days. And if we go to our settings and the device name is just what's assigned when the OS gets installed, but you can also specify this in your task sequence when you deploy it through SCCM. But it did join my domain, so that's good. And then if we search up Software Center, this is what gets installed through SCCM when the OS gets deployed. So you can see we have applications. There's nothing here because we don't have anything imported into system or SCCM. But like, let's say we had Chrome or 7-zip. If we had that imported and we allowed our users to install that on their machines, then it would appear here. And there's some other things in here like updates. If we had updates for Windows, then they would appear here for users to download. And then there's some other things like device compliance. You're able to check if it's compliant with your policy through SCCM. And then some other options like remote access and work information. You can specify your business hours, things like that. That way you can have maintenance windows for when Windows applies updates, because you don't want Windows applying updates and rebooting your machine during your business hours. So back here in the Config Manager console, as you can see, that deployed computer that we just installed appears in the console under devices, and it has the client installed. That's why you see this green check mark next to it, and of course under the client tab. It also automatically gets assigned to my site code, so every SCCM site has its own code, and this is unique to that site. So there's a couple things, there's actually a lot of things you can do with these devices. Like for example, you can install the client if it doesn't already have it installed. You can run scripts on the device. You can update your endpoint definitions. You can run diagnostics. You can do remote assistance. There's a whole bunch of things you can do. For example, we will, let's see here. We'll just RDP into this machine from the Config Manager console. So let me just do this real quick. So I have remote connected to that machine that we just deployed, or that virtual machine I should say. Everything's still here. So that's just a small thing you can do with SCCM. But yeah, other than that, there's you can also deploy software updates. So on a schedule, let's say like you have a patching window or something like that, you can deploy software updates to those PCs on a specified schedule. I have imported, or I have synced with WSUS, or Windows Server Update Services. Everything, I think I just specified all classifications. There's a couple things that you have to do in WSUS, but I believe, yeah, none of these are deployed to that VM that we just installed. But anyways, that's also something you can do within SCCM. So one last thing I wanted to mention are some useful resources if you want to play around with SCCM. Surprisingly, the documentation from Microsoft is actually really good. There's a lot of good details for deploying SCCM, configuring it, managing updates, and all the planning that has to go into SCCM. I followed a YouTube channel called Patch My PC. His name is Justin, and he has a lot of in-depth videos on setting up SCCM. He's I believe a retired or former Microsoft engineer. So that's who I watched while setting up SCCM. And also the System Center Dudes website, just give that a Google. They have a lot of good guides, very in-depth to set it up. Obviously, I couldn't cover everything that SCCM has to offer in this project or video. There's a lot more that it can do, and I only scratched the surface on its capabilities. So if you're wanting to explore more of SCCM and what it can fully do, then I recommend checking out these resources.